Okay, here we are, Unit 2, Question 3. So we're taking a look at Malthusian stagnation. Okay, we're going back to things that we'd been studying in the classroom. So we learned about the stagnation, how population and wages were tied together in an endless relationship of growth and decline leading to the trap, right? We had that scenario where a large population of factory workers led to low wages, right? Workers were a dime a dozen, so they weren't very valuable, and they didn't require much pay. Okay, that caused the workers' health to decline because they didn't have enough money to live on. Population also declined, and then suddenly workers were scarce, and businesses had to up the ante, pay the workers a little bit more, and then they were able to be more prosperous and thrive and multiply until they multiplied too much and had a demise. Right, and that was the up and down that we're starting to see. And then the question is, what happened in 1810 to 1860 that enabled people to escape that trap? Right, so we're looking at societies that were really stimulated by economic gains, right? The workers were looking at maximizing the factory owners were looking at maximizing their profits, right? And by them working in their own self-interests, the population was being kept sort of in an equilibrium, but at the expense of many of the people in the population. And then suddenly everything shifted, right? And we see this from the 1800s, boom, things changed. So here's a little clue. Go back to figure 2.21 in your book. And if we do that, let's find it. Here it is, 2.21. Here we are escaping the Malthusian trap. Okay, if you remembered, what we needed to have happen here was that shift. Okay, and so we went from the Industrial Revolution. We're having these up and down times. Things were kind of stagnant. But when we look at the big picture here, we can see there was a lot of different things that took place that caused the wages to grow and the health and production to grow all at the same time without having that fall. And we see there was some demands by the population. There was laws that were passed by legislation. And if we look here in more detail, we have let's see, extension of the right to vote, restriction on the employment of women and children during factory hours. So there was legislation that was put forth that stopped that practice from happening, where workers demanded that they continue to get paid, that they continue to get valued, that the factories invest into their workforce in a steady way. And because that legislation came in and forced that situation to change, they were able to spring that trap. And what happened from that was people became more specialized in their work, production became more effective and more efficient. There was more disposable income, more innovation of product, and things just continued to grow. But without having that legislation, right, without having that outside push saying, wait a second, you can't keep doing this, we might not have ever sprung that trap. So going back to our book, number 3, okay, so tell us what happened. Number 4, we're looking at that escape from the Malthusian trap can be understood by incentives, right? The incentives, the workers were given more incentive to work better for better pay. The factories then benefited from greater production and efficiencies, okay? And we're going to take a look at that. Where do incentives come from? Because it didn't come from the market. Okay, in this case, the Malthusian trap, those incentives came from the government and from the people, from the demands of society. Okay, and now we're at a place where we're looking for another industry to kind of step up to the plate and help us through this virus, right? We want to see the pharmaceutical industry make a vaccine, make some tests, make something that's going to help us be able to combat this virus. But what's the incentive for the pharmaceutical industry to really do that? Sure, they're going to make some sales, but it's short term. It's a lot of time and work and effort to be creating new solutions to current problems. Normally, a vaccine will take about a year and a half to develop. And factories, they'll develop it, pharmaceuticals, when they see that there's a long-term gain that they can get from that vaccine. What happens if they create a vaccine for COVID-19 and then it's all done and who needs that vaccine again, right? And what's the incentive for them to be dropping everything else that they're doing to change and start creating this vaccine? And we already saw with the Industrial Revolution, it's not because the businesses love the people they serve, right? Businesses are looking for their bottom line. So we're looking at where is this incentive. So let's go take a look at Unit 21, because it's going to explain to us a lot more where incentives come from. So I'm going to go over to my book. Here's Unit 21. And we're looking at innovations. Innovations that enhance our well-being are a hallmark of capitalism, right? Making the most of human creativity and inventiveness is a public policy challenge, okay? So we can say, oh yes, it's wonderful that the United States is the biggest innovator of tech and tech industry in the world. But why is that? Why is it here in the United States and not in Germany or not in Korea? Okay, why is the USA so big with tech innovation? And the answer is because public policy. Okay, we have an environment here that makes it very easy for new businesses and ideas to form, for people to register companies, for people to get funding, for startups, for their ideas. It's a very open and supportive environment. So that's why we have so much innovation here in the United States. It's a policy piece. But let's go look at what the chapter is saying a little bit more. So here we have innovation depends on many factors. Okay, so the state of knowledge, and that's another thing. In the United States, we have a robust university system, so that helps our innovation because we have educated people that are ready to think about things differently. Individual creativity, and all of our culture is about doing things differently. So change is embraced. People taking a risk are celebrated. So that also helps to build more innovation in the United States because it's a norm. Public policy, economic institutions, and social norms. Okay? And so far, so good? So then we have individuals or companies who introduce socially beneficial innovations are rewarded with profits above the opportunity cost of capital. Okay, and we have this word innovation rents. So let's go unpack that a little bit. So the opportunity cost of capital is how much it costs for somebody to do something new. Okay, so how much does that opportunity cost me? If I was going to make a vaccine for COVID-19, let's say I'm a pharmaceutical company, my opportunity cost would include staff, laboratory equipment, time, space that I'm renting in, any kind of infrastructure that's supporting the use of my laboratory, any kind of paid human subjects, insurance. All of that are the opportunity costs of capital, right? It's money that I need to be investing into creating this new innovation. Okay? And I want to make sure that my return on investment, right, my reward, my profits are more than what I've spent on developing this particular vaccine. Okay? And innovation rents is the cost, right? Think like rent, you pay rent on your apartment. So rent is sort of like the cost that you're going to have to pay to have this innovation exist. Okay? So here we have innovation rents are eventually competed away by imitators who spread the new knowledge by using it. Okay? So you have the competition come in. So you've invested the money and the time and resources into creating this, and now other people are going to be doing something very similar. The production and use of new knowledge is unusual in 3 ways. Okay? So, and this is really interesting too, because how do you value and create economy around knowledge, right? Because knowledge isn't something that can be bought or traded. It can be shared, okay? It could be converted into products such as lessons and classes and books, okay? But knowledge itself is something that's contained within the individual. So here we have knowledge is a non-rival good. Okay, so producing new knowledge is initially costly, right? For example, creating a new curricula or creating the ability to create a COVID-19 vaccine. but once it is produced, it can be distributed and used for free. Okay, so that's the same thing. Once we know how to make that vaccine, it can be replicated again and again and again. Okay, same thing. Once you've created your online program, you can then give it to everybody over and over and over. So innovations become more useful as more people use them. Okay, so in the business world, we call that scaling. In the business world, we call this prototyping, right? It takes more time to prototype a product, to create it all for the first time. And once it's there, it's very easy to replicate, scale, spread, and that's where all the money comes in. Okay, so here we have innovating firms often have little immediate competition, right? Because you're the only one doing it, you're the lone wolf out there, and they can profit by setting prices far above the marginal cost of production, right? And we saw that with Fauci, our person right now who's running the CDC, I think he's CDC, Centers of Disease Control. He made millions when he was working in the HIV industry and creating the first pharmaceuticals to combat the HIV virus, which were incredibly expensive. And so that happens, right? You need to have that so that you're covering the cost of the investment. So there's that incentive. But then what's the cost, right? There's that disadvantage to the consumer. Those initial HIV drugs were very, very expensive, and many people were not able to afford them. So, and that's why we see that pharmaceuticals, new pharmaceuticals are very expensive. And then later you start seeing the generic versions come out, right? But the initial original versions are very expensive. So now we have innovating firms can't capture all the benefits of their innovations they generate, so they may invest too little in innovation, right? Because it's a huge risk. If other people are going to start copying that, if prices are going to start getting lowered before you can recover your costs, where's the incentive to continue to innovate in any kind of industry? So in steps public policy. Okay, public policy seeks to spread socially beneficial innovations while at the same time providing adequate rewards for those producing innovations. So an example of public policy could be grants, government grants. We have the National Institute of Health, the Centers of Disease Control, National Institute of Mental Health. All these organizations are government-funded organizations. They can be working along with the pharmaceuticals and developing new drugs, new innovations. Okay, they could be funding the pharmaceuticals. A lot of times the pharmaceuticals will get funding by the government to work on a particular study. Universities are also places where a lot of innovation can come from, where the cost of that is being paid for by the students. Also by public policy, a lot of the state universities are getting public funding from their states. They can also get government grants. So there's a hybrid way of being able to offset the cost of new innovation, especially in industries such as the pharmaceutical, where you can get access to funding in many different ways, and then policy can also direct development of certain things that are going to help provide that reward so that businesses, the private companies, do go ahead and pull those different ideas from the universities together, pull those different studies from the National Institute of Health together, and mass produce, create that vaccine that everybody can be using. All right, we're almost done. So here we have a trade-off, right? So we have the trade-off of intellectual property rights, okay, which means if I've created a vaccine, I own it. That's my intellectual property. I created it, I owned it. If I designed, let's say, a new car, I can have property rights on that too, right? I can have my patent. So intellectual property rights is sort of like the patent for a new idea, okay? But sometimes the intellectual property rights might be too strong, okay? So let's say a university says, you know, I've created this new thing in my lab, or a particular student did it in his doctoral project, and he said, these are my intellectual property rights. And then that innovation will never leave that lab, right? It'll never get out into the larger world because those would have to be purchased or they would have to expire, and it's a disincentive for new information to get out there. Or the other thing is if the intellectual property rights are too weak, right? if the, let's say the college student that's in the lab that's creating some kind of new innovation knows that whatever he creates is going to be owned by the university or taken right away from him or her, they might not want to create that product. They might not want to put that extra time and effort into what they're making. So there's that balance, right? So we have to make sure that there's enough innovation rents, right? Innovation rents is enough return on investment, okay, to sufficiently reward the innovators, right? To make the businesses want to go out there, take that extra step, invest, for example, into creating a coronavirus cure, okay? All right, so now we have something else here. Digital technology digital technology support two-sided markets. Okay, like Facebook, eBay, and Airbnb. They match individuals who can mutually benefit from exchanges, right? So I have a house with an extra room, Airbnb, and I have a person who's traveling to a new location and needs a place to stay. Airbnb is going to match that together. Okay. Why is this important? These technologies have altered the nature of competition, but they exhibit many of the same market failures observed in the production of knowledge. So let's see what that means. So now my competition, it's more evenly spread, right? So my opportunity cost to be able to get, let's say, my new innovation out into the field has been lowered, right? By using Facebook, eBay, Airbnb, Amazon, right? There's many ways for me to go and share my information and be able to start benefiting from what I've created, okay? But there's still that same problem of everything else where are my property rights too strong or too weak? Are other people going to start copying what I'm already doing? Is it worth it for me to put all the work into creating this when other people can so quickly engage and start benefiting from the work that I've done? Okay, so this is where we're at. Okay, so we have these dynamics, we have these opportunities, we have these incentives, we have this way that things work. As we go through this chapter, we take a look at a case study looking at HIV, okay, and how back in 1998, there was many pharmaceutical companies, okay, over 37 other multinational companies that were all working in AIDS research, okay, and we have lawsuits, right? We have a lawsuit against the government of South Africa because they didn't want them to be importing generic drugs to be treating HIV AIDS, okay, in South Africa. So 1 in 10 of the population was HIV positive. There was 5 million people. There was high death rates. It was infecting entire families, completely affecting their economy, okay? But we're looking at the cost of creating those drugs, right? These laboratories spent a lot of money creating these drugs that were able to now serve these people, but the South Africans didn't have the money to buy those drugs. But they could go and get non-brand name drugs, right? Other companies that have taken the information that Bristol Myers Squibb, Merck, and the other companies had created, and now they were mass producing that and selling it at a lower price. So what happens, right? Is that ethical? Is that not that ethical? What does that look like from an economic perspective, right? It makes sense economically. They're the ones that invested into developing the drugs. They're the ones that had all of that that rent that they paid, right? Their innovation rent. So why wouldn't they be able to benefit from that, right? Or we can be looking at this is human lives, right? Why would we prevent people from being able to be cured if they're sick, right? If we're able to cure them, do we really have to be providing so much wealth to these companies that already are wealthy? Okay, so these are big questions, right? And these are questions that we continue to ask again and again. Okay, so we can go through this and continue to look at what happened, right? So now we have Al Gore was president of the United States at the time. So now we have the USA government is getting involved. We have USA patent laws, right? So the patents were on these drugs, but other companies had gotten access to how to make them and they were creating the drugs. Is that legal? Is that not legal, right? That's where we have that lawsuit. Whose side are we supposed to be pursuing, right? We have these pharmaceutical giants, okay? They have tremendous resources, huge budgets, revenues, investors, but at the same time, they have these tremendous laboratories where they're creating new innovations that other people couldn't otherwise create, okay? So millions of dollars have been spent on litigation. It's 3 years later, okay? And we're still trying to deal with what's happening, right? We have public opinion, okay, and damage has been done. Okay, and we find out that the probability of any drug company suing a developing country on a life-saving medicine is extremely low based on what they learned in South Africa, because the social cost of that decision for those laboratories was so high that it damaged their reputation so badly that they would have been better off just letting the low-cost drugs get in and let the people get better. Okay, but they still have to keep the lights on, right? So pharmaceutical company owners can't sell a treatment at less than what it costs them to manufacture it and stay in business, right? So, and we have it, the industry's success rate is just over 4%. So there's a huge amount of time and money spent on creating things that never worked, okay? Most things that the drug companies create do not work and we never see them. So the behind the scenes costs are pretty astronomical and pretty complex. And all we see on the outside is that successful 4%, right? Those few drugs that do work. And then the idea is that by selling them, they cover the cost of the developing of the other 96% of the drugs that never did work, but needed to be created in order for those 4% to come up. Okay? So continue reading through this. We're talking about fishermen in Kerala, okay, and looking at, well, what happens again when you're looking at prices and competition and innovation. And the last thing I want you guys to listen to is this right here. We have F.M. Scherer, and he's an economic historian, and he specializes in the effects of technological change, right? And he's talking about how patents support innovation in pharmaceuticals. So listen to this. So now we're starting to see a little bit more complexity when we're in our COVID-19 world and people say, create a vaccine, create a cure, okay? Suddenly it's not just so easy to run and do that, right? There's a lot of behind the scenes and there's a need to have incentives. And what we saw also, the way we got out of our Malthusian trap was through that idea of incentives. So now we're looking at where do you see an incentive for a firm to manufacture a COVID-19 vaccine, right? Because we know once that vaccine is created, it's going to be recreated everywhere, okay? Professor Sethi says the vaccine development is not profitable, okay? What does he mean? And according to him, how should the vaccine be developed? Okay, and he has a solution to this. So let's go listen to what he says. And this is really important because this is starting to tie into your final project where we're looking at the role of the government, right? The government as an economic actor. And that's going to be really important because we're going to see this invisible hand, as invisible as we want it to be, is not going to be sufficient for the good of society as a whole. Okay? Excellent. So enjoy that, and I'll see you soon.